Hi everyone, happy Monday. Welcome to the Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either is fine. As you know, the Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project to talk about corruption or anti-corruption using words that everybody can understand so that we can fight corruption in our day-to-day lives with just a little bit more than good intentions. We get to talk about a typology. As you know, typologies are concrete models or concrete steps that you take to carry out a phenomenon. So for example, if we were talking about corruption, a typology for bribery would be the steps that the way you pay an actual bribe. Now today we have to talk about sexual extortion, which is a type of corruption, but in and of itself is not exactly a typology because there are several typologies of sexual extortion, but this is such a big phenomenon that we must discuss it. Now, sexual extortion is the abuse of entrusted power to sexually exploit vulnerable persons. Vulnerable how? Well, people who are vulnerable or who are in need of the person who holds that power. As you know, corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, and in this case, this more specific case, that private gain takes the form of sexual benefits, sexual favors. Now, how would this happen? You might think, a good example is, think of refugees. Several refugees who move away from war-torn countries into other nations are in need of public services from those countries, from the new countries. And it happens, sadly it happens a lot of the time that in order to receive those benefits, the people are exploited sexually. They are the people extract from them sexual favors in order to receive things like water, food, or education. It happens sadly every day. Transparency International last week issued a new document, a new report called Breaking Silence Around Sexual Extortion. And the point of this report is to put a name, to properly identify and put a name and give a face to sexual extortion so that people can understand it and we can fight it better. It's a type of corruption. It's not a universal type, but it's so murky, so complex and nebulous that we need to understand it. Now, in that report, they issued several findings. The first one is they noticed that sexual extortion is present in every sector, every sector of human life, either public or private, companies, public service, schooling, everything, education, everything, everywhere. Sexual extortion is seemingly everywhere. It unfortunately mainly targets either women or vulnerable groups. Vulnerable how? Most of the time they are trans people, transgender people, people who don't identify with one of the binary genders, and people who are vulnerable to sexual attacks in general, but mostly women. Number 3, it is harder to find or to identify than other forms of corruption. For many reasons, one of those might be a cultural taboo, because there are several taboos and misconceptions and prejudices attached to denouncing corruption. A person who denounces a form of sexual abuse might feel that he or she is now tainted. In addition, most of the time, in most cases, it's very hard to prove coercion. Now, the element of sexual exploitation, think of sexual extortion as a bribe, as somebody extorting a bribe from someone, but instead of demanding money, they demand a sexual favor. Now, it's very hard in these cases to prove that sexual act was coerced, was forced. That's one of the main issues. There are very few or no mechanisms to prevent or to approach this phenomenon, and there are several instances of re-victimization. Number 4, victims or survivors risk additional extortion via legal action. Now, what could happen in many countries is that these people, by coming forward, they would be essentially, under those legal systems, they would be essentially confessing to bribery, even though they didn't pay that bribe with money, they paid it with sexual favors. And because these legal systems are so obscure or so silent on these issues, that person might be subject to prosecution simply by blowing the whistle, which means that the actual perpetrator of the crime might still run free and the victim would probably face criminal action. Number 5, there is not enough information to know the reach and consequences of sexual extortion because it is not a properly criminalized and identified and legally identified conduct. There isn't enough information, and the mechanisms that we do have to measure pervasiveness or gravity of improper acts are simply not tailored to gauge sexual extortion. What does this mean? What does this mean? This means that the people who ask the questions to understand how much crime is happening and what type of crime is happening are not asking the right questions because they don't have the right tools to address sexual extortion. The 6th finding is that regulation on sexual extortion is simply inadequate. Again, not enough rules to prevent it, not enough rules to investigate it, not enough rules to address it or to sanction it. Essentially, the legal framework around sexual extortion is very weak because by itself, it is, again, a relatively unknown phenomenon. That doesn't mean that it's new. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It means that we as society simply don't address it. Now, TI in its report issues several recommendations. Number 1, to criminalize it and establish a legal framework for it. To criminalize a conduct means essentially that legislators, lawmakers, the people who decide what a crime is or isn't, among other things, will have to create enough elements and identify this conduct as a separate individual independent crime. What would that look like? Modification of a criminal code to state that the person who commits this or this or this act, who essentially obtains sexual favors by exploitation of power or public office, is committing sexual extortion, and to create a system for law enforcement around it. Number 2, training must be given to judges and prosecutors. The people who are in charge of enforcing the laws or administering justice have to receive special training, special professional training to understand sexual extortion and to understand its victimology, its criminology, the way it manifests, how people commit these crimes, and how to treat or how to address survivors or victims in order not to re-victimize them. Number 3, it must be included in our systems and our trainings that are aimed to prevent corruption and to prevent gender violence. Now, people who do this, we are often called on to train people in other organizations, to teach classes on what is corruption, to explain to people how corruption happens, how gender violence happens, and Transparency International concludes that these trainings should also address by name the notion of sexual extortion, both trainings and systems concerning corruption and trainings and systems concerning gender violence. Number 4, we need to have campaigns to raise awareness. People have to understand that sexual extortion is a thing, that it exists, how it manifests, and that it is a crime, that if it happens to you, it merely happened to you and you are a victim, but you're not guilty of anything. It isn't your fault in any way, and that can only happen with public campaigns that help to raise awareness. 5, we must have gender-sensitive whistleblowing mechanisms. Now, a whistleblowing mechanism is just a system. It might be a website, might be a telephone line, or a service that people can use to blow the whistle on improper conduct. You essentially call them and you accuse someone of doing something wrong. And these mechanisms, by international best practices, have to be anonymous and they have to protect against retaliation. These mechanisms have to be adapted to address the issue of sexual extortion, in addition to addressing issues concerning bribery, concerning sexual harassment, and other misdeeds. Number 6, these mechanisms have to reach the people. We have to have campaigns that make the people aware of these mechanisms. You as an individual, as a citizen, as a constituent of a company or of whatever type of organization, you need to know that these mechanisms exist and how you can use them, that they are anonymous, that you will not be retaliated against, all that good stuff. If people don't know that they exist and how they work, they will simply not use them. Number 7. Legal assistance has to be provided to victims or survivors. And by the way, we simply adhere to Transparency International's use of the notion of victim or survivors. Some people identify as a victim for several good reasons, and some as survivors for several other good reasons. We use both so as not to discriminate. Now, legal assistance to victims or survivors is paramount. They have to have access to legal professionals who may be able to represent them in any proceedings that might arise from them blowing the whistle. The idea is that if you blow the whistle, you have to feel secure that you will be anonymous and protected. If, however, you have to give up anonymity, you must be sure that somebody will be there to protect you. Victims or survivors must also be given protection. If you're brave enough to blow the whistle, then you shouldn't have to worry about possible acts of retaliation. So that means modifying the legal system, the legal tools, and actually the physical and public policy tools to provide protection to victims and survivors of sexual extortion. How would that look? Well, it might be physical protection. You know, they provide you with personnel to look after you, or it might be legal protection, or both. What would legal protection look like? Restraining orders, things like that, or preventative imprisonment, things that are meant only to protect the victim or survivor of the extortion. Specialized training has to be provided to personnel concerning sensitivity and non-re-victimization. Now, the personnel that deals with the victims or survivors of sexual extortion from the beginning of the process, the blowing of the whistle, all the way until the end of the proceedings, have to receive special sensitivity training on how to behave and how to treat the victims or survivors so as not to re-victimize them, so as not to further violate their human rights. And number 10, statistical systems have to be modified to fully understand the phenomenon. Again, if you can't measure it, then you can't control it. So we as an industry and as a profession need to modify the instruments that we use to measure corruption so that they can also get a gauge on sexual extortion so that we can better understand the phenomenon and thus control it. So that is it for today. Thank you for joining us. Again, this was The Wife of Caesar. And as you know, every act of corruption should be denounced. Please blow the whistle, but do so safely. If you're not sure whether or not what you're looking at is corruption, or you're not sure that you're entirely physically safe, don't do anything, refrain from acting, reach out to people who might be able to help you. Feel free to reach out to us at info@streiner.mx and we will be glad to help you. But above all, please stay safe. Again, this was The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Bien, or Michel Bien, either is fine. And you have a happy Monday.